He commanded the shadows of Seoul with a whisper and a blade. Kings feared his silence. The police feared his reach. But the most dangerous man in South Korea was currently paralyzed by a simple sound. The soft click of a key in his front door. Seo Jae-kwon had built a fortress to keep his enemies out, but he never realized he'd trapped himself in. Until the woman who dusted his shelves started tearing down his walls. Before we dive in, please like, subscribe and tell us where you are watching from. At 2 a.m., deep within a brutalist concrete mansion in Gangnam, Seo Jae-kwon sat in a sea of blue light. The glow from a dozen security monitors illuminated the ink on his skin. Tattoos that served as armor against a world that had tried to kill him once before. He was the monster of the Seo Syndicate, a man who survived by trusting no one and watching everyone. And right now he was watching her. Through the pixelated feed of the West Gallery, he tracked Aaliyah Monroe. She moved with a composed grace that didn't belong in a house of violence. Her warm amber presence cutting through his cold, sterile world like a sunbeam hitting ice. She was just his maid. A woman here to clean up the messes of a life he hated. But as she stepped into his office, ignoring the no disturbance rule to set a cup of tea on his desk, Jae-kwon realized his greatest threat wasn't an assassin's bullet. It was the way she looked him in the eye and saw the man hiding behind the monster. And for the first time in 10 years, the walls didn't feel like a sanctuary. They felt like a cage. The tea grew cold, but Jae-kwon didn't touch it. He watched Aaliyah move through the shadows of the office, her presence a quiet defiance against the brutalist architecture of his life. She didn't flinch at the sight of the jagged scar peeking from his unbuttoned collar, nor did she look away from the tattoos that marked him as the head of the Seo Syndicate. To the rest of Seoul, he was a ghost story told to keep rivals in line. To her, he was apparently just a man who needed a drink. Your father's debt was 40 million won when I bought it from the collectors, Jae-kwon said, his voice like gravel. He didn't look at her, but at the reflection of her white apron in the dark glass of the window. A maid's salary doesn't even cover the interest. You'll be scrubbing these floors until you're 80. Aaliyah didn't pause her movements. She folded a silk throw with clinical precision. Then I suppose I should get back to work, Mr. Seo. My father always said a debt is a promise, and I don't break mine. Jae-kwon felt a flicker of irritation. He reached into the pocket of his trousers and pulled out a stack of high-denomination bills. An amount that would have taken her months to earn. He dropped them onto the mahogany desk. It was more than a tip, it was a test. He wanted to see her scramble for it. To see that hunger for survival that defined everyone in his world. Take it, he commanded. Consider it a bonus for the late hours. Aaliyah stopped. She walked toward the desk, her footsteps silent on the polished floor. The warm amber light of the desk lamp caught the deep brown of her skin, making her look like a statue carved from precious wood. She looked at the money, then slowly looked up, meeting his cold blue-lit gaze. She picked up the stack of bills, but she didn't tuck them away. Instead, she placed them back on the desk, sliding them toward him until they touched the base of his cold tea. Our agreement was for a wage, Mr. Seo, not a charity case, she said, her voice calm but immovable. I sell you my time and my labor. My dignity, however, isn't on the payroll. Jae-kwon's hand tightened around his cigarette. Most people would kill for that stack of paper. And that is why you sit in the dark watching cameras, isn't it? She countered softly. Because you think everyone has a price. She turned to leave, her silhouette graceful against the cold concrete walls. For the first time in his life, Jae-kwon felt the weight of his gold. Not as power, but as a burden. He had tried to buy her, and in her refusal, she had exposed the one thing his money couldn't fix. His absolute, terrifying loneliness. In the days that followed, the silence in the mansion grew heavier, charged with the static of things left unsaid. Jae-kwon found himself pacing the halls of his estate, not as a master inspecting his domain, but as a restless ghost. He began to notice things he had ignored for years. The way the concrete absorbed the sound of human life, and how the narrow, high-slung windows seemed designed to keep the sky at a distance rather than invite it in. He entered the library, a cavernous room filled with rare books he never read. intending to find a file Minho had left behind. Instead, he found Aaliyah's leather-bound portfolio tucked beneath a stack of archival blueprints. He knew he should close it. His life was built on the sanctity of secrets and the ironclad boundaries of privacy. Yet, the same curiosity that kept him glued to his security monitors compelled his hand. He flipped the cover open. He expected to see grocery lists or sketches of the Chicago skyline she had left behind. Instead, he found his own home. But it wasn't the fortress of gray shadows and reinforced steel he inhabited. On the cream-colored pages, Aaliyah had reimagined the Seo estate with the soul of an architect and the heart of a dreamer. Her charcoal lines tore down the windowless walls of his master suite, replacing them with soaring glass partitions that opened toward the Han River. She had sketched a central atrium where the cold marble floor currently sat, filling it with tiered gardens and skylights that allowed the sun to track across the floor like a golden clock. In her drawings, the blue room, where he spent his nights, was no longer a tactical hub. It was a sanctuary draped in soft textures, designed for warmth rather than surveillance. Jaquan stared at a specific sketch of the gallery. She had drawn a silhouette, unmistakably his, standing not in the darkness, but bathed in a column of light descending from a vaulted ceiling. A soft rustle at the door made him look up. Aaliyah stood there, a polishing cloth in hand, her gaze dropping to the open portfolio. She didn't rush to grab it. She didn't apologize. She simply watched him, her expression a mix of vulnerability and quiet observation. "It's a prison, isn't it?" Jaquan asked, his voice barely a whisper. He looked at the sketches, then at the oppressive concrete walls surrounding them. "You didn't draw a house. You drew an escape." Aaliyah stepped into the room, the amber afternoon light catching the edge of her frame. "A house is built to protect the people inside, Mr. Seo," she said gently. "A prison is built to keep them from leaving. I just thought, someone like you deserves to see the sun without having to look through a camera lens to find it." Jaquan looked back at the drawing of himself in the light. For a fleeting second, the walls around his heart felt less like armor, and more like a weight he was finally tired of carrying. The smell of iron and rain followed Jaquan into the kitchen. He had returned from a meeting in the docks, the kind where words were discarded in favor of cold steel. And though he had walked away, his sleeve was soaked with a dark, blooming crimson. He sat at the island, his breath hitching as he tried to peel the fabric away from the shallow graze on his forearm. "Let me." Aaliyah's voice came from the doorway, steady and devoid of the panic he usually inspired in others. She didn't wait for his permission. She moved into his space with a first aid kit, her hands warm as she guided his arm into the light. As she cleaned the wound, her fingers brushed against the intricate ink that climbed from his wrist to his shoulder, dragons and shadows designed to intimidate. But as the antiseptic cleared the grime, her touch lingered on a jagged, uneven ridge of flesh that no tattoo could truly mask. The contact triggered a violent flicker in Jaquan's mind. He was back in that rain-slicked alley 10 years ago, the taste of copper in his mouth as his older brother, the only man he had ever loved, twisted a blade into his side. "For the family, Jaquan," his brother had whispered, leaving him to bleed out in the mud. The betrayal had been more lethal than the steel, a wound that had never stopped festering beneath his ribs. "This one didn't happen tonight," Aaliyah whispered, her thumb grazing the old, knotted scar. She didn't look up, but her touch was impossibly light, as if she were trying to soothe a decade of phantom pain. "This is the one that built the walls, isn't it?" Jaquan winced, not from the sting of the alcohol, but from the precision of her words. He wanted to pull away, to assert the terrifying distance that kept him safe, but his body wouldn't obey. He felt like a wounded animal finally cornered by a hand that didn't intend to strike. "My brother thought my heart made me weak," Jaquan said, his voice a low, jagged rasp. "He tried to cut it out. He failed, but he took everything else. He taught me that trust is just a slower way to die." Aaliyah looked up then, her dark eyes reflecting the amber warmth of the kitchen. She didn't offer pity. She offered a terrifying kind of understanding. "He didn't take everything, Jaquan. He just made you afraid of what's left." She finished bandaging his arm, her fingers lingering for a second too long on his skin. For the first time, Jaquan didn't see the tattoos as armor. In the quiet of the kitchen, they looked like a map of a man who had been lost for a very long time. The following evening, the mansion's atmosphere shifted from a fragile sanctuary back into a cold command center. Minho, Jaquan's second in command, and the man who had helped him bury his brother's body 10 years ago, stood by the window of the blue room. He watched the rain lash against the reinforced glass, his reflection sharp and predatory. Jaquan sat at his desk, his bandaged arm hidden beneath the sleeve of a charcoal suit. He was staring at a security feed, but for once, he wasn't looking for intruders. He was watching Aaliyah in the library, her head bent over a book, her presence the only warm thing in the house. "She's an anomaly, Jaquan," Minho said, his voice smooth and laced with a manufactured concern. He didn't turn around, letting his words hang in the air like a slow-acting toxin. A woman with her intellect, her background, working as a maid for a pittance? It doesn't scan. Jaquan didn't look up. "She has debts, Minho. I've seen the records." "Records can be forged. Backgrounds can be bought," Minho countered, finally turning to face his boss. He leaned against the desk, casting a shadow over the monitors. "I've seen how you look at her. And more importantly, I've seen how she looks at this house. She isn't just cleaning, she's observing. She's too smart to be just a maid boss. Those blueprints you found? They look less like dreams and more like a map of our vulnerabilities." Jaquan felt a cold knot tighten in his stomach. The paranoia that had kept him alive for a decade began to hum like a live wire. "She's a dreamer, Minho. Nothing more. Is that why she spends an hour every night on the terrace, out of range of the interior mics?" Minho leaned in closer, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "Who is she really calling at night? Chicago? Or is she talking to the Park Syndicate? They've been looking for a way into this fortress for months. What better way than a woman who has already convinced the tiger to let her stroke his fur?" Jaquan looked back at the screen. Aaliyah was turning a page, her expression peaceful. But through the lens of Minho's words, that peace looked like a mask. The memory of her touch on his scar, once a moment of healing, suddenly felt like a tactical probe, a search for a weakness to exploit. "Keep a closer eye on her," Jaquan commanded, his voice returning to its habitual, icy detachment. "And get me the logs for her outgoing calls. All of them." Minho bowed slightly, a small, triumphant smile playing on his lips as he exited the room. He had done his job. He had refortified the walls, and once again, Co Jaquan was a man alone in the dark. The temperature in the mansion seemed to drop 10 degrees the moment Aaliyah stepped onto the terrace. The night air was biting, but the frost radiating from the man standing by the railing was colder. Jaquan didn't turn as she approached. He stood with his back to her, a silhouette of sharp angles and suppressed violence, silhouetted against the neon bleed of the Seoul skyline. In his hand, he held a translucent tablet displaying a list of outgoing international calls. The timestamps were a rhythmic indictment. Every night, 11:15 p.m., a Chicago area code. "I told you once that trust is a slower way to die," Jaquan said, his voice devoid of the rasping warmth it had carried in the kitchen. It was the voice of a judge delivering a sentence. I was beginning to forget my own rules. A dangerous mistake. Aaliyah stopped, her phone still gripped in her hand. She felt the shift in the air, the invisible glass wall slamming down between them. "Mr. Co?" He turned then, and the look in his eyes made her blood run cold. The man who had let her touch his scars was gone. In his place stood the monster who ran the syndicate. He stepped into her personal space, his height used as a weapon of intimidation. "Who is he?" he demanded, his voice a low lethal vibration. "The man you speak to in the dark. Is he the one who told you to draw my house? The one who told you to play the role of the tragic, brilliant architect until I was soft enough to bleed?" Aaliyah stepped back, her heart hammering against her ribs. "I don't know what you're talking about. I'm not. Don't lie to me." The roar was sudden, echoing off the concrete. He snatched the phone from her hand, his grip like a vice. I have the logs, Aaliyah. Every night. The same number. Tell me who he is before I have my men find him and end the conversation permanently. It's my brother, she cried out, her voice breaking the heavy silence. His name is Marcus. He's 19, he's a sophomore at UIC, and he's the only family I have left. Jaquan froze, his thumb hovering over the delete key. The fury in his eyes flickered, replaced by a haunting, jagged confusion. He's the only reason I'm here, she continued, her voice trembling with a mixture of fear and fury. I call him to make sure he's eaten, to make sure he's studying, to hear a voice that doesn't sound like it belongs in a graveyard. I'm not a spy, Jaquan. I'm just a sister trying to keep her brother from the life I've had to lead. She reached out and snatched her phone back, her fingers brushing his cold skin. This time, there was no spark, only the sting of a deep, structural fracture. Jaquan looked at her, and for a second, he looked small against the vast, dark expanse of his own wealth. He had built his walls so high that he could no longer distinguish between a threat and a heartbeat. Without another word, he turned and walked back into the darkness of the house, the glass door sliding shut with a final, echoing thud. The silence that followed the confrontation on the terrace was a living thing, thick and suffocating. Jaquan didn't sleep. He sat in his darkened office, the blue glow of the monitors reflecting off his hollow eyes. He wanted to believe her. He wanted to believe that the Chicago area code was a lifeline to a brother, and not a tether to an enemy. But in his world, truth was a luxury he couldn't afford. And Minho was always there to provide a more convenient reality. I took the liberty of doing a sweep while she was at the market, Minho said, stepping into the office with the quiet confidence of a man holding the winning hand. He didn't say a word as he placed a thin, manila folder on the desk. I didn't want to believe it either, Jaquan. But the evidence was under her mattress. Jaquan's heart felt like it was being compressed by iron bands. He opened the folder. Inside were photocopies of the CO Syndicate's logistics routes, internal documents that never left the high-security server in the basement. They were handwritten notes on the margins, detailing the very vulnerabilities Aaliyah had reimagined in her architectural sketches. The betrayal hit him with the force of a physical blow, sharper and deeper than his brother's blade. It wasn't just the leak. It was the realization that she had used his own yearning for light against him. Every moment of shared vulnerability, every soft word in the kitchen, every touch on his scars, it had all been a performance. She hadn't been trying to find the man behind the monster. She had been looking for the cracks in the armor, so she could shatter it. He stood up, his chair scraping violently against the floor. He walked to Aaliyah's small, modest quarters at the end of the servants' wing. The room smelled of her, vanilla and old paper, a scent that now turned his stomach. He began to tear the room apart, his movements frantic and fueled by a cold, desperate rage. He ripped the sheets from the bed and tossed the books from her nightstand. There, tucked inside the hollowed-out spine of an architecture textbook, he found it. A small, encrypted drive with a rival syndicate's emblem etched into the plastic. Jaquan sat on the edge of her bed, the drive heavy in his palm. The heartbreak was a familiar weight, a cold homecoming. He had spent years building walls to prevent this exact moment. And yet he had let a girl with a sketchpad and a soft voice walk right through the front gate. I knew, he whispered into the empty room, his voice cracking with a grief he couldn't hide. I knew it was a mistake to breathe. He looked at the door, waiting for her to return, his jaw set in a mask of ice. The man who had briefly hoped for the sun was dead. Only the boss remained, and the boss knew exactly what had to be done with traitors. The office was a tomb of cold marble and blue light. The syndicate files, the digital death warrants Minho had found in Aaliyah's room, lay scattered across the desk like shards of a broken mirror. Jaquan stood by the floor-to-ceiling window, his back to her, his reflection a ghost against the Seoul skyline. In his hand, he balanced a heavy black pistol, the metal looking cruel against his tattooed skin. I gave you the keys to the house, he said, his voice a low jagged rasp. I gave you the only thing I had left that wasn't stained. And you sold it to the Cho clan. Aaliyah didn't flinch. She stood in the center of the room, her maid's uniform a stark contrast to the violence of the accusation. I didn't sell anything, Jaquan. Look at me. Don't, he hissed, finally turning. His eyes were bloodshot, the eyes of a man who had stayed up all night mourning a woman who was still standing in front of him. He stepped toward her, the barrel of the gun lowering but not disappearing. The silence between them was thick with the scent of ozone and betrayal. The logs show these files were accessed from your terminal. My men want your head. Minho is waiting outside for my signal to take you to the basement. He stopped inches from her. He reached out, the barrel of the gun tracing the line of her jaw with terrifying tenderness. Run, he whispered, a desperate command. The back gate is unguarded for 10 minutes. Take your passport. Go back to Chicago and never look at a man like me again. If I see you after tonight, I will have to be the monster they think I am. No. Aaliyah stepped into his space, her chest nearly touching the weapon. She didn't reach for the gun. She reached for the tablet on the desk. You're so blinded by your own ghost stories that you can't see the math. Look at the timestamps, Jaquan. Really look. She shoved the screen toward him. Her finger trembled, but her voice was iron. These files were moved into my folder at 10:14 p.m. last night. Where was I at 10:14? Jaquan's gaze flickered to the screen, then back to her. The memory hit him like a physical blow. At 10:14 p.m., he had been in the library, and Aaliyah had been sitting at his feet, reading aloud to him because he couldn't sleep. She had been in his sight. She had been in his arms. The realization shattered the last of his walls. The files were a plant. The betrayal wasn't hers. It was from within his inner circle. The gun clattered onto the marble floor. You were with me, he breathed, the paranoia finally breaking. I was with you, she whispered, stepping into the circle of his shadow. Now stop trying to save me by throwing me away. Start trusting the person who actually stayed. Outside, the heavy footsteps of his security detail neared the door, but for the first time in a decade, Jaquan wasn't looking at the monitors. He was looking at her. The air in the concrete corridor was thick with the smell of wet earth and exhaust. Minho didn't wait for an order. He took the silence for a death sentence. As the heavy doors of the office swung open, he moved with the cold efficiency of a man who had spent a lifetime pruning Jaquan's garden of enemies. He gripped Aaliyah's arm, his fingers digging into her skin like iron talons. The boss is sentimental, Minho hissed, dragging her toward the subterranean garage. He can't do what's necessary. But I've spent 15 years keeping this empire standing, and I won't let a girl with a duster bring it down. Aaliyah stumbled, the rough floor scraping her knees, but she didn't scream. She looked at the man who had been Jaquan's shadow, and saw only a hollow shell of loyalty turned to rot. They reached the center of the garage, where the black sedans sat like waiting predators. Minho drew his suppressed pistol, the movement fluid and final. A ghost for a ghost, Aaliyah. You'll be forgotten by sunrise. A sharp, metallic clack echoed through the vaulted space, the sound of a hammer cocking back. Let her go, Minho. Jaquan emerged from the shadows of a concrete pillar, his silhouette cutting a jagged line against the fluorescent lights. He didn't look like a boss. He looked like a man who had finally walked out of his own cage. His weapon was leveled steady, pointed directly at the heart of the man who had served him since they were boys. Move away from her, Jaquan commanded, his voice vibrating with a terrifying, quiet fury. She's a distraction. Minho shouted, his composure finally fracturing. I gave you everything. I bled for you when your brother tried to kill you. You're choosing a maid over me. I'm choosing the truth over a lie, Jaquan said, stepping into the light. You didn't protect me, Minho. You fed my paranoia, so I'd have no one but you. You didn't want a leader. You wanted a prisoner. Minho's eyes darted to Aaliyah, his finger tightening on the trigger in a final, desperate act of spite. Before he could squeeze, a single shot rang out, thunderous in the confined space. Minho's shoulder exploded backward, his gun skittering across the oil-stained concrete. Jaquan didn't fire a second time. He didn't have to. His security team, sensing the shift in gravity, swarmed from the stairwells, pinning Minho to the floor. Jaquan ignored the chaos. He crossed the distance to Aaliyah in 3 long strides, pulling her up from the cold ground. He didn't check the perimeter. He didn't look at the monitors. He tucked her head against his chest, his hands trembling as they shielded her. For the first time, the concrete didn't feel like a fortress. It felt like a foundation. The Seoul skyline was no longer a grid of security threats and strategic vulnerabilities. From the high balcony of the new penthouse, it looked like a map of possibilities. 6 months had passed since the concrete silence of the Syndicate mansion was broken. Jaquan stood in the warmth of the afternoon sun, his black shirt unbuttoned at the collar, the heavy ink on his forearms catching the light. He had traded the dark monitors for the open air, systematically dismantling the cruelest arms of his family's legacy until the CO Syndicate was a ghost of its former self, repurposed into a legitimate engine of urban development. Aaliyah emerged from the glass doors behind him, her movements no longer defined by the quiet, invisible grace of a servant, but by the confident stride of a woman who had reclaimed her soul. She stood beside him, and for a moment, they simply watched the city breathe. The golden handcuffs were gone, replaced by a partnership forged in the fire of the previous winter. "You're late," Jaquan murmured, his hand finding hers. The touch was no longer hesitant, it was an anchor. "I was finishing the drafts for the Chicago project," she replied, leaning her head against his shoulder. "The community center in the old neighborhood needs more light. I'm thinking of floor-to-ceiling glass, like your office, but without the secrets." He smiled, a rare, genuine expression that reached his eyes. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, weighted envelope. "Then you'll need a place to finalize those plans. Officially." Aaliyah opened the envelope. Inside was a sleek, embossed business card and a heavy brass key. The card read, "Monroe Architectural Firm." Below it, an address in the heart of the city's revitalized district. "Jaquan," she whispered, her breath catching. "The debt was paid months ago. You didn't have to." "This isn't about debt," he interrupted, turning to face her. The shadows that had lived in the hollows of his cheeks for years had finally vanished. "You looked at a prison and saw a home. You looked at a monster and saw a man. I didn't give you this firm, Aaliyah. I simply built the walls you designed. You're the architect. I'm just the man lucky enough to live in the world you've built." He led her to the edge of the terrace. Below them, a courtyard that had once been a gray expanse of stone was now a flourishing garden, the green shoots of spring fighting through the earth. They stood together in the unapologetic glare of the sun, no longer hiding, no longer watching. The ruins of their past were buried deep, and for the first time in both their lives, the view ahead was perfectly clear.